Hello friends, my name is Martinez and today I'll be reviewing my most recent reads. It was a really great reading month, especially compared to other months in quarantine, so let's get right into it. First up, I have Afterlife by Julia Alvarez. This is literary fiction in which a woman named Antonia Vega retires from teaching English at a university only to have her husband of many years pass away suddenly, and then one of her sisters goes missing, and then the pregnant girlfriend of one of the undocumented workers that works on the farm next to her house shows up at her doorstep. So it's a lot of things at once. This has content warnings for death of a loved one, xenophobia, and suicide. Despite the fact that it does feel like a lot of different things are happening to Antonia, I would say that this is a more quiet plot. It's a shorter novel and it really focuses on a narrow time frame, and a lot of what we're doing is going through Antonia's observations and her thoughts. There are two things here that I really enjoyed. First was the writing. If you're not somebody who can be wooed by a story with the writing alone, I wouldn't necessarily say that this is for you. I just really enjoyed Alvarez's style and how good she is at capturing feelings and emotions and experiences. Alvarez is Dominican and so is Antonia, and there were a lot of observations here about being an immigrant, about family, and about language that I really enjoyed. And then on top of that, because Antonia is an English professor, there are a lot of literary references here, lots of quotes. The second thing that I enjoyed here was that this was an exploration of grief, and it was one that came to a few conclusions or looked at certain elements of grief that I don't think I have seen in fiction, at least not recently. One was this idea of how the people that we lose live on through us, and not only like in our memories, but in the ways that they have influenced or informed us as people. And you see Antonia a lot of times asking, what would Sam do? Or what would Sam say if he were here? And kind of using that as a guide, and then realizing that that is how he's living on. And the second is the idea of being in grief, but you know, the world goes on and things keep happening to Antonia, and so she has to explore this idea of, you know, where to draw the line of taking care of herself because she's not okay, but also other people needing her. My one big complaint about this was that because it was so internally focused, some of those plots and supporting characters fell a little bit flat. Overall though, I did enjoy this and I ended up giving it 4 out of 5 stars. Next up is If I Never Met You by Mhairi McFarlane. This is adult contemporary women's fiction chick lit, and in it we follow a woman named Lori. Her boyfriend of over 10 years breaks up with her, and so it leaves her reeling, and things are complicated because they both work at the same law firm. To make things even worse, her ex-boyfriend immediately has a new girlfriend, and that girlfriend is already pregnant. Lori hatches up a plan with the law firm's hot boy playboy Jamie, and they decide to fake date. For her, it's going to serve as, you know, kind of sticking it to her ex-boyfriend, and for him, it's going to make him look good because he's trying to impress the partners and show them that he can have a steady girlfriend. He isn't just a playboy. So this is fake dating and office romance. It is an interracial couple. At one point, they only have one bed, but it has no on-screen sex scenes. I think that my enjoyment of this was very much influenced by me thinking that this was going to be a pure romance. I got this because I was just looking through the romance section of available ebooks through my library, and I was like, that looks good. I went into it wanting and expecting a romance, and then the first 80 to 90 pages of this are just Lori dealing with the breakup. Looking back on it, that portion of the book was done very well. I really enjoyed the way that McFarlane explored the breakup and the sorts of feelings she was having, questioning herself, questioning their relationship, questioning him. But I was expecting a romance, and it took so long to even establish the couple that was at the heart of that. When I tried to kind of like separate my expectations from how I experienced it, I still come up with the fact that maybe it went on for too long at the beginning of this book. My second complaint is in that same vein, where it wasn't awful, but it was something a little bit off, and the main character is black, and I believe that McFarlane is white. There were some things that the character brushes off that I feel like wouldn't have been so easily brushed off, or would have been portrayed differently by somebody who was also black. For instance, there was a point where somebody asked to touch the character's hair, and I didn't buy her reaction. She goes to a hair salon, and so much emphasis is put on how the stylist loves to do her type of hair that the interaction just felt weird. weird and forced. The main character at one point gave Jamie like cookies for doing what I felt was like the bare minimum in a situation, and that didn't feel authentic to me. It's almost like a half a point. Like, good on you for realizing that these are things that would have come up in an interracial couple or would be part of a Black woman's experience, but like half points because he didn't fully get there. That said, I really enjoyed Lori as a character. I thought she was capable, smart, and really funny. I enjoyed her relationship with Jamie. Jamie was an above average like male love interest. We didn't spend so much time with him that I would call him a favorite or even particularly memorable, but in the context of the story, he was perfectly fine. I enjoyed the progression of the story, and I really enjoyed looking at all of the additional details of Lori's life. For instance, the breakup makes her reconsider a lot of things, and so we get to explore her relationship with her mother and father, and then also her relationship with her best friend. There's very much a message in here about like the importance of friendship, which, you know, I'm always down for. Overall, I thought that this was enjoyable, and I also gave this 4 out of 5 stars. Next is So You Want to Talk About Race by Ijeoma Oluo, and this has been on every anti-racist reading list, and for good reason. It is nonfiction exactly about what you would expect. It goes into several topics kind of under the umbrella of race issues in the United States, and then explores why we talk about them, and then how to talk about them also. This was wonderfully organized and very clear, and you can just feel the patience and the care with which Oluo writes. My main takeaway from this, even though I've been exposed to a lot of the topics that she covers, was just her wording for certain situations. At the time that I read this, I was running very low on patience for these conversations, especially in my real life. So seeing her break these conversations down to foundational pieces and just saying like, approach it this way, talk about it this way, this is why we talk about it. And just in general, that message of this is hard, it sucks to experience it as people of color, but they're also hard conversations to have, and there are situations where you are likely to mess up as you learn. So that message of yes, it sucks, but we have to do this work, and it's worth it to do this work, and our humanity is worth sort of the discomfort of doing this work. I really appreciated that throughout, and it is highly recommended for good reason. It is a wonderful foundational piece for any work of anti-racism, and it is perfect for anybody who is starting to do this work or trying nonfiction. As someone who doesn't regularly read nonfiction, this reads extra smoothly, and like I said, is very clear, concise, and easy to read. I gave this 5 out of 5 stars. Next, A Heart and a Body in the World by Deb Caletti. This is a young adult contemporary about a girl named Annabelle, and she's really struggling after surviving a very traumatic event, and so almost on a whim, she decides that she is going to run from Seattle to DC. And her family is very confused by this decision, but then we see that her grandfather joins her, kind of following her along in his RV, and her friends and brother take on the role of her PR team, and she becomes a reluctant activist because of her decision to go on this run and because of what she has survived. I'm going to front load this and say that I absolutely love this, and I think it will be one of my favorite books of 2020, but I'm going to put timestamps in the description for this portion of the video, not because of spoilers per se, but the way that Caletti writes the book, it is without acknowledging for a very long time what the event that Annabelle survives is, and it is very purposeful, and I understand why she did it that way, and it is impactful because of a lot of parallels that she draws. But in order to talk about that more deeply and to give content warnings, I have to kind of name it. So if you are interested in this and in going into it without a lot of information, just skip ahead to this timestamp. I don't think knowing ruins anything per se. Your mileage may vary, you know, your sensitivity to spoilers and things of that nature. Content warnings for this book include gun violence, murder, loss of a loved one, PTSD, panic attacks, and self-harm. So yes, this book is about gun violence. What this book does is take a look at the way that misogyny informs gun violence. So while you are trying to figure out what exactly happens, you see those two threads weaving together, and the way that it explores both misogyny and gun violence is done absolutely wonderfully, smartly, and it is just a gut punch. Sometimes in books when you have a ploy this way where something is being withheld from you or there are vague mentions to something in the past, it can grate. But I think that by writing it in the third person present, it still gave us intimacy. I felt connected to what was happening to Annabelle, but it also allowed for urgency. It felt like we were running from and to something. It never felt heavy-handed to me because it felt more like this was a product of what Annabelle was experiencing and her trauma and PTSD rather than a product of a plot, or it didn't feel like a tool for getting us somewhere or creating a mystery, but rather like I understood why Annabelle, telling it in Annabelle's voice, would create this particular story. I don't know what it is to be a survivor of a shooting, but anytime that Annabelle talks about feeling unsafe in the world, like I felt that deeply. And in working through what has happened and working through her trauma and reasserting her desire to be here, she has to contend with how she's been socialized. And she thinks a lot about what women do in order to feel safe. The way that we are trained to be nice, to be quiet, to accept everything gracefully for the sake of our safety. My once a video mention of Nicole, but I always joke with Nicole about running because she is a runner and I am one of those people that is like, boo, running. Like I cannot stand running. I've tried. It's not an activity that I enjoy. But in this book, I felt like I could understand why running, and it's all things that runners talk about, like the benefits of running or why they enjoy it. But in this context, I was just like, I don't know, I felt like I understood the way that running really matched up with the story, the things that she was processing while she was running, and the way that running was kind of like the platform for her to do it. I mentioned that there is a content warning for self-harm because there is also a way that she is using running to almost punish herself. It is obviously a very heavy story, but it is written so well. I loved a lot of the details, including her grandpa and her friends, the people that she meets along the way that books and music are talked about, particularly through the lens of experiencing and processing grief. I loved that therapy was portrayed in such a positive light. And in general, this was a book where, because I experienced it so strongly in my emotions, it took me a while to even begin to process why it was so successful. And I still feel like I'm just coming back to, I don't know, it hurt my heart, but that's where I am right now. I gave it 5 out of 5 stars. Next up is The Alchemy of Us by Anissa Ramirez. This is a nonfiction book from Ramirez, who is a scientist, a science writer, and basically she looks at 8 different inventions and tells us a little bit about how they came about, but also ties that to a human experience. I picked this up because Nicole and Deboki from Okie Dokie Boki have a book club for nonfiction books, and this was their choice for July. They have been picking books that have not been on my radar at all, and I'm just like, yay, I will read that. So this is a book that was not on my radar at all, and it was a really interesting reading experience through watching them discuss it and then also discussing it with Nicole as I was reading. Like, I hesitate to really talk about the things that I didn't like about this because I feel like there was a lot worthwhile here, but I did have a really mixed reading experience, and I think that the connections that Ramirez was trying to make were more successful in some stories and less successful in others. The information was all really great, and just the premise of this, not only how inventions affect society, but how people affect inventions and the sorts of things that we create out of necessity, and the way that those two things just keep informing each other. The general structure of each chapter was really great, and at times she would start with like a broad topic and I wouldn't know exactly how we were getting there, but you just saw that she was weaving these certain stories together, stories that started smaller and with certain people or situations and then got bigger into these broad ideas and, like, in general, human experience. The things that I didn't like about it was that there was almost a little bit of a negative tone in some of these chapters where it was like technology, boo. And I understand why. Humans have been negatively impacted by technology at points, but the negative tone got to me in certain places. And I would have been able to more accept, like, her conclusion, even though I didn't agree with it, if those conclusions felt like a natural progression of the story she just told or her own legwork. But in certain stories she came to like this boo technology conclusion or any other conclusion, and it didn't feel like that's what she was getting to. It didn't feel like that's what her stories or her connections necessarily portrayed. But again, those were conclusions. So it was the final pieces of each chapter or story that she decided to tell. So it didn't ruin the whole thing, and the information was interesting, but I don't know, like I had to mention those things, and I ultimately gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next, Fate of the Fallen by Kade, and this is adult fantasy in which a man named Aslo is a forester. Basically, he is tasked with living and caring for the forest, which is really important inside of this society. And he's best friends with Matthias. They've grown up together, and at the beginning of the story, they both learn, they didn't know, but Matthias is basically a chosen one. There is a prophecy about him that says that he will be the only one who is able to save this world from certain destruction and doom. And so Matthias gets ready to go on his journey and save the world. Aslo decides to abandon his forest and his home and go with Matthias because that's like his brother. And almost as soon as they start off on this journey, Matthias is killed. And so everyone's kind of like, well, that was our only hope. But Aslo feels like he has to now take on this mantle and to help to do something to try and save their world. I buddy read this with Sam from Thoughts on Tomes. I hadn't done a buddy read in a little bit. I tried to do one earlier in quarantine with Jocelyn, and that failed. My fault. Sorry again, Jocelyn. So it was really fun to go back to that format. I think I ended up liking this more than she did. I got a copy of this arc from BEA in 2019, and I was sold on it by like kind of the back of the book pitch, which was, what if Frodo had died at the beginning of Lord of the Rings and Sam was the one who had to continue on the journey? Like, that is such a great like premise, especially because I love Sam, and I was like, this is amazing, this is great. But this story is not that at all. You can see the very beginning of it is the chosen one dies and the forester has to keep moving. But Aslo is not a Sam character. Like, Aslo is a badass, and he's been training next to Matthias like all his life, even though he doesn't think much of himself and he doesn't realize everything that he is capable of, doesn't realize how training alongside Matthias has equipped him for this journey. He is still like equipped, he is still capable. I really loved Aslo as a character. I loved his sort of like grumpy, I just want to be in a forest, please leave me alone sort of demeanor, but at the end of the day he won't give up, and he can't give up. So he continues even though like odds are stacked against him, people keep leaving him, people keep telling him he can't do this. He's still going to do it because he's driven by this idea that like someone has to try. This is told in multiple point of views, and one of the big pitfalls of ever doing multiple POVs is that you run the risk of having one that's better than the other, and this happened to me here. I was enjoying myself when we were with Aslo. When we jumped away from him, I was kind of like, boo, bring Aslo back. So it was a kind of an uneven reading experience. That gets better towards the end when you see how the stories are really interwoven and the importance of each character, but at the beginning especially I was just like, okay, let's get back to, you know, the journey and the adventure. Also, there was just like a lot going on here in terms of all of the different characters and villains. Like, there were so many bad people, I could not keep it straight. There was even like a whole like deity element of it. Then there are also like the magicians and the foresters, a lot of different type of people, but we jump around so much that it didn't feel like I spent any time really getting to know any one particular set of people, or that I really understood like the cohesiveness of this as a journey. It felt very scattered. The ending was great, and it introduced another element that I'm like, ugh, I would read more about this. But ultimately I feel like if there were a second book available right now, I would probably read it. If you're asking me to wait another year for a second book to come out, like, I'm not sure how much of this is going to live strongly in my memory. Overall, I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next is We Are Not From Here by Torres Sanchez, and this is a YA contemporary about 3 teens who are facing violence in their hometown in Guatemala and make the decision, are forced to leave their hometown and migrate towards the US border through Mexico. This has content warnings for gun violence, death of a parent, rape, sexual assault, dismemberment, and on-screen death of a child, and just in general violence against children. I want to be clear that while I am Latina, I am not from Guatemala or Mexico, so I can't speak to the representation representation. This book starts with our three main characters, Chico, Pulga, and Pequeña, and basically just describing and establishing their lives. Once we kind of get to the point where we realize why they would leave and why they can't stay, we then see them embark on their journey. One of the ways that migrants travel from Central America to the US border is by riding on top of these cargo trains, and so we follow them on their journey and see not only the danger that they face while riding the rails, but also all of the danger that they face in terms of people who take advantage of migrants, what happens to women who embark on this journey, just the physical toll that it takes on them, and then ultimately what happens if and when they reach the US border. I almost DNF'd this book, to be honest, because the beginning is a little bit on the slower side, and she establishes characters by some repetition. She's really carefully and slowly showing you the setup of their lives, kind of where they're coming from. Looking back on it, it's another piece that I appreciate, because even though the pacing ultimately feels uneven, I think that Torres Sanchez does a good job of carefully balancing what she's representing in terms of the good and bad of their lives, the good and bad of living in their small town, the good and bad of the people they encounter on this journey, and ultimately asking the question of, if the journey is this difficult, what would make somebody leave? And she painted that picture even before we knew that she was. So in retrospect, the book looks a little bit different, the story looks a little bit different, but in practice, reading it, really the pacing was off. Obviously, these are very heavy topics, and because we are dealing with teens, it could have went into an area that, even though this is based on true events, that it felt kind of sensationalized. It never felt that way to me, particularly because, again, there's so much balance in the storytelling in terms of looking at the things that they are experiencing, but also doing character work and tying the emotions that you feel not only to what's happening and the violence and the things that they are facing, but to the characters themselves and understanding their relationships to each other, and also taking a very close look at what they are experiencing emotionally and internally. This is one that had me thinking and that got me very emotionally invested, and I gave this 4 out of 5 stars. I decided to pick up a work that she references, I think in her acknowledgments, and it was The Beast by Oscar Martinez. This is a nonfiction work that is by Martinez, who is a journalist, and basically he spends many years in Mexico riding the rails, interviewing migrants, interviewing government officials, and also people who work for nonprofits that help migrants, people who live in towns that have heavy migrant traffic, people living in border towns between Mexico and the US, and even officials in the US and Border Patrol agents. I think it was really neat to read both of these things together. I received a lot of information through the work that Martinez did, and the way that Torres Sanchez fictionalized it, grounded it in like a more narrow experience. I will say that The Beast has a couple of issues just as a book, and one was that I felt that it wasn't well organized. It really jumped all over the place. You don't follow any sort of track or timeline. And the second is that this is a translated work, and while it's translated well enough where you understand everything, there is a little bit of awkwardness that I would attribute to the translation. Obviously, I haven't read it in Spanish, but there's something that happens when you translate from Spanish to English, and a lot of times it comes just one from some of the formality that I feel like exists in Spanish that doesn't exist in English, but also when you translate from Spanish to English and from a lot of languages, there are certain word order things that you have to account for. There was a little bit of awkwardness for some of those English things that you just kind of know in terms of like ordering words or what sounds better to the ear. Overall, though, it didn't take away too much from the experience, and I ended up giving this 3.5 out of 5 stars. Next is The Voting Booth by Brandy Colbert. This is a YA contemporary about a girl named Marva who is super excited because she gets to vote in an election for the first time. She's very invested in the election and politics and activism in general. Our second character is Duke, who is less enthused about voting, but he understands the importance of it and is doing it more from a sense of obligation. He meets Marva at his polling place, but it turns out that he can't vote there. He's being turned away, and Marva takes it upon herself to help him find his correct voting place. They skip school together to go on this whole adventure and figure out what's going on and get Duke to vote. The Voting Booth, Afterlife, and We Are Not From Here are 3 that I listened to on audiobook, specifically because I received advanced listener copies from Libro FM. Through this program, Libro FM provides free copies like an ARC, but with an audiobook version. If you want to learn more about Libro FM, which is a really great service, especially if you're looking for ways to divest from Amazon, I will leave their information down in the description. I listened to this audiobook basically all in one day. It was a very sweet and cozy story. Like, it felt really good to be reading about people like gallivanting outside and also like, you know, voting and being really invested in politics and trying to, you know, change the world from the comfort of my apartment in quarantine where I could do basically none of that at the present moment. I'm not a huge reader of YA contemporary, so I feel like in some ways I wasn't the intended audience for this, but I did overall enjoy it. It obviously has a very clear defined message about the importance of voting, and I feel like there is a lot of important information here about registering to vote, your polling place, and what to do in a situation if you're being turned away. Some of that messaging, well, I can take a step back from and say that's really important. In the reading experience, it was a little bit heavy-handed, but I can also say that if I were a teen, that would certainly play out differently for me. And this is something that like, if you're a librarian, if you have younger readers in your life, like, I would highly recommend. I will say that as somebody who's like hit or miss with like insta-lovey stories, this did it really well, and I think it showed you how their personalities were matching, why they were both in like the exact right spot to meet and start to catch feelings, and it didn't overplay kind of the seriousness of what they experienced. At the end, it felt like the exact right place for these two people to be after what they experienced. There were things around this like main point of voting that were a little quieter and that were the best sorts of moments for me. So a lot of the things around music and music as healing was really beautiful. This idea of like achievement and having goals, but also being able to enjoy smaller things in life and creative things in life. And there was something around interacting with the police while Black that was also very moving to me. This was a great weekend read, great read for a readathon, something to consume very quickly that will be smooth and enjoyable, and I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. My last 3 books to talk about are books that I already talked plenty about and recently in my Reading Rush vlog. So first is An Absolutely Remarkable Thing by Hank Green, and this is science fiction in which a girl comes across a mysterious statue and makes a YouTube video about it, and it goes viral because it turns out the statue is not only in New York City where she is, but has shown up mysteriously all over the world. I originally gave this 4 stars when I read it, but I bumped it up half a star because I enjoyed it even more on a reread. As I mentioned previously, this has a very strong conversational tone to it. It's like a chatty story. It feels like somebody is just coming at you with like a stream of consciousness almost, which can be something that is off-putting to certain readers. And the main character at the head of it is somebody who is definitely flawed and who throughout this is making questionable choices, partly because of personality things and ways that she's sabotaging herself, but also partly because she's put in this position of like intense scrutiny and sudden fame. This is a really great character-led sci-fi in which the sci-fi element and the ultimate mystery of it plays second fiddle to just the exploration of those larger themes of what it means to have a platform and be a person who is also a brand and deal with fame and power and the things that all come with that. I enjoyed those explorations a ton. I had a lot of fun with the sci-fi element even on reread, knowing what was happening. It didn't take away from the story because of the fact that it wasn't reliant on that element, even if you can guess right away what these things are, and you probably will guess right away what these things are. There's still so much to be found in the story rather than that one twisty mystery thing. Next, I read Beach Read by Emily Henry, and this is a romance in which a woman named January, she is a romance author, but she's struggling to write her next book and she's on major deadline. And this is also bringing about financial worries, so she decides to go to a beach house to stay there until she can write. It's a great solution for her, except for this beach house. She inherited it after her father passed away, and it was a house that he shared with his mistress, which she didn't know about. So she has a lot of conflicting feelings about going there and spending the time there, and then when she gets there, it turns out that the person in the beach house next door to hers is also an author who is struggling to write his next book, but he writes like darker literary fiction, and so they kind of clash at first, and they end up challenging each other to write in the other's genre and setting up these sort of like challenges to teach the other person how to write a happy ending or write a darker ending. Chances are that if you heard this talk about, you've heard good things, and also this idea that it is a little bit darker than your regular romance, and there are some heavy themes in here, including cancer, death of a parent, child abuse, and They even go and interview a death cult at one point. While both of these characters are dealing with issues that are obviously heavier and that are affecting their lives and their ability to write, I think that Henry does a really great job balancing the more humorous elements and the banter between the two characters. I loved January and Gus both. I thought that they were both funny. I enjoyed the way that they played off of each other. I enjoyed that they owned up for their behaviors, even though they had excuses or reasons for acting in the way that they did within the context of the relationship. I love books that are sort of meta in the fact that this is an author writing about other authors and the sort of commentary that she has built in about romance books or literary books with darker endings and things of that nature. It was really funny to me, particularly in the dialogue, and I think Henry has such a knack for this sort of like fast-paced, witty type of writing. I ended up giving this 4.5 out of 5 stars. And my only little nitpick is more of like a personal enjoyment thing, which is why it's like half a star less. Romances basically are supposed to end with a happily ever after, but sometimes you get a happily for now, in which it doesn't like project like, and then they were together forever, or give you the epilogue where they have children, and it's just like, these two people are together right now, the end. I personally enjoy happily ever afters versus happily for nows. Like, I don't want the reality of like these two people might break up, who knows. That's not what I'm here for. I'm here for the fake stuff, and they will live forever as soulmates, and you know, that's kind of what I'm here for. And this takes that on, this idea of what it means to be happily ever after, and whether relationships have value if they end, and that they can have value even if they do end. And so the way that it explores that and the way that it ends is kind of like a combination of these two things almost, and that's kind of what I'll say to not spoil it. And I get it, and it fit with what Henry was describing, but again, my personal taste is I don't want any of that. I want happily ever after. So I was just kind of like at the end because of that. Not to say again that it was badly done. It fit in with the rest of the story. I just was like, you couldn't give me this one thing and promise me that these two people would be together forever. Fine. Finally, I read Big Friendship by Aminatou and Anne Freidman. This is a nonfiction book that is part memoir about these two women's friendship, but then also explores ideas that pertain to big friendship or best friendship or friends that are very essential to each other's lives. So they share information about friendship and research about friendship and the ways that we connect with each other. I enjoyed this at a baseline, but there were parts of it that were much better to me than others. If you are somebody that enjoys more self-helpy type books, memoirs and self-help, this would be like a great combination for you. But I personally don't enjoy self-help type books, and even the more informational part of the story I feel like could have been told better or written better by other authors, whereas the memoir parts of it, like nobody else could have written those things but these two women, because it was their friendship. So I enjoyed the memoir pieces more. I thought they were more engaging and more well written. There is something really strange that they do, and I understand why they chose to write it this way, but they write as a collective we, like we did this, we did that, and if they're referencing one person in particular, they'll do it in the third person, like Anne grew up in such place and Aminatou did such thing. It makes sense because they're telling the story jointly, but at times it was a little bit awkward knowing that it was two people like referring to themselves in the third person, put a little bit of awkwardness and distance there that I'm not sure needed to be there. I don't know how you could have written this book otherwise, and again, I understand why they chose to do it this way, but it was weird at points. Overall, I gave this 3.5 out of 5 stars. If you guys have read or would like to read any of the books that I've mentioned, let's chat down in the comments. Thank you so much for watching this video, and I will see you guys soon. I'm only giving my brain the good stuff these days when I can, you know, outside of reality and news, I guess. I don't know, it's time to wrap up this video. I think she mostly sticks with reading one book at a time, so she was like, I read 100 pages, I'll read it again, and I was like I'm always reading like 7 books. So anyway, she read it much faster than I did. Like, I'm not sure how much of this is going to, somebody walked by and it scared the crap out of me.